Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Unit 28, which is the Reagan-Bush era. So let's go ahead and let's get started talking about that. So we first have to talk about Ronald Reagan's presidency. Ronald Reagan was born in 1911. He became a radio announcer after graduating from Eureka College and actually had a career in Hollywood starting in 1937. He actually became the president of his professional union, the Screen Actors Guild. In 1966, Reagan served as governor of California for 2 four-year terms. He made brief attempts for presidential nomination, but did not succeed in this until 1980. Reagan had an optimism about America. He believed heavily in the greatness and potential of the American people. It was important to keep in mind that during his campaign for nomination, Reagan talked about things like eliminating the Department of Education, which Congress had created during Carter's term, and Reagan saw as a drain on federal funds. He also proposed a large tax cut to stimulate the economy, and that Reagan's thinking was that whatever federal revenue might be lost could be made by people putting that money into the economy in other ways. This was what was known as supply-side economic policy, and Reagan heavily supported this during his time. Now, whenever it comes to the Republican nomination, Reagan's primary challenger for this was a man named George Bush. And Bush actually had large criticism for Reagan's economic plans, calling them voodoo economics. Now, out of a crowded field, Reagan emerged with the Republican nomination, and he actually decided to choose George Bush for his vice president. And the two men were able to put aside their differences about Reagan's economic plan. President Carter, on the other hand, had issues. He may have been the incumbent, but he had a challenger for the Democratic nomination in the form of Edward Kennedy. Edward Kennedy portrayed Carter as being too conservative and too inept to be an effective leader. And because of this, Carter had to defend his record and ask the people to trust him and to trust that things would get better under his leadership. Carter defeated Kennedy in the primaries, however, and received the nomination. Reagan issued a lot of sharp criticisms of Carter's record, repeatedly asking the American people, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" And apparently, America was very much ready for a change. Reagan swept that election, winning with a 44 million to 35 million popular vote and 489 to 49 electoral votes. Carter only won 6 states in this election. The Democrats continued to hold a majority in the House, but conservative Southern Democrats who supported Reagan's ideas gave the president a working conservative majority in the House. Now, Reagan's campaign was supported by a swing in the voter population, too. The voter population was swinging more towards traditional values and beliefs. Amongst these voters was a new, primarily conservative Christian voting base that became known as the religious right, being formed by Baptist preacher Jerry Falwell. Falwell formed what was known as the Moral Majority, a group that promoted ideals such as traditional family structures, prayer in public schools, things like that. The Moral Majority encouraged people to become politically active. That political activism became the group known as the Religious Right, a voting base that still is in existence today. At 69 years old, Reagan was the oldest man to ever become president. And as he was sworn in, the American hostages in Iran were released after 444 days. Just 2 months into his term, Reagan and his press secretary James Brady were shot after a speech in Washington, D.C. Reagan made a full recovery, but Brady was permanently injured, and his family actually fought for stronger gun control afterwards through what was known as the Brady Bill. The would-be assassin was not found guilty by reason of insanity. Whenever it comes to general decision-making process, he was a very no-nonsense whenever it came to decision making. After a 1981 illegal strike of air traffic controllers, which almost paralyzed the nation's air traffic system, Reagan issued a back-to-work order. After that back-to-work order was defied, the president actually fired the workers and authorized the training of entirely new ones. Whenever it comes to economics, Reagan was able to get large tax cuts through Congress during his term, and inflation was brought under control. However, this period was also when the largest federal budget deficits occurred. And the Reagan era actually produced the biggest deficits to date in American history, with Congress and the president blaming each other for said deficits. By December of 1982, unemployment had risen to about 10%, and some taxes had to be raised to increase revenue. Reagan made several cuts to government programs while increasing military spending. The economy did recover somewhat during Reagan's presidency, even though much of that recovery was based on money borrowed to finance the government's deficient spending. But on October 19th, 1987 was the worst of economic downturns during Reagan's era, when the Dow Jones average in the stock market lost about 22% of its value by falling 508 points. Now, a significant portion of this loss was accredited to computerized trading, which was a system that automatically triggered sales of stock when the price fell a predetermined amount. But for the most part, the economy recovered somewhat during Reagan's presidency. Reagan's presidency also continued the space program that had begun with the space race of the 60s and 70s. In 1981, the first reusable space shuttle, known as the Columbia, was launched from Cape Canaveral. And Sally Ride became the first female astronaut in 1983, riding on board the reusable Challenger space shuttle. However, on January 28th, 1986, tragedy did strike during this period of time, when the Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff, killing the 7-man crew. This explosion was due to a failure on the O-rings, causing a fuel leak. It was recommended that the launch be delayed, but pressure from NASA officials caused that advice to not be heeded. Now, because of the Challenger incident, shuttle flights were grounded until September of 1988, while safety practices were fully put into place. Another thing that occurred during the Reagan era was the AIDS crisis. The first case of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, known as AIDS, was identified in New York in 1979. These number of cases increased dramatically in the 1980s. Medical researchers determined that the AIDS disease was caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. This disease was originally found in Africa and attacks the individual's immune system, leaving the body open to illnesses. Most people die of complications related to said illnesses than from HIV/AIDS itself. This disease is transmitted by contact with the bodily fluids of an infected person, and while no cure has been found, drugs have been produced that enable a person to live a long life and manage their viral count. There are even drugs nowadays in place that allow for people to interact with people with HIV as a protective measure so that they don't get said disease. So it's kind of cool, even if there is no cure in place currently. There's still research for it, though. Now, HIV/AIDS during this period of time created a significant amount of public fear, as it became known and unsupported ideas about transmission were commonplace. People weren't sure how you got it. People weren't sure how it was transmitted. There was a lot of fear about the illness. More than 25 people around the world are estimated to have died of AIDS-related complications since 1981. With about 33 million people are estimated to be living with HIV/AIDS today. about 1 million of which are living in the United States. About 50,000 new cases and about 15,000 deaths from HIV/AIDS occur in the U.S. per year. Now, whenever it comes to the 1984 election, the economy was in better shape, and the Reagan-Bush team seemed unbeatable. The Democrats nominated Walter Mondale, and he chose a woman named Geraldine Ferrero to serve as his running mate. This was the first time that a woman was chosen for a national ticket by a major party. And it was an amazing step, but it was honestly no contest that Reagan and Bush received 59% of the popular vote, the biggest landslide for Republicans in history, and Reagan got his second term. After serving as president, Reagan returned to California with his family. During his second term, actually, Reagan's economy made significant improvement. Inflation was cut in half. The stock market rose. Unemployment fell. And overall economic growth was had. The federal debt grew significantly because of the years of deficit spending, but even that statistic was cast in a new light. But he returned to California with his family after serving, and by 1994, Reagan revealed that he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He passed away 10 years later in 2004. Reagan was known as the great communicator, and while his period of time has had some criticism to it, especially whenever it comes to federal spending federal deficits, he has had the ability to capture the American mood and the American dream in his speeches and brought back a lot of life to the disillusioned public that had been under Carter's presidency. Let's go ahead and talk about Reagan's foreign policy, because Reagan's foreign policy is actually pretty interesting. Now, Reagan had been an ardent opposer of communism for many years and referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire in some of his speeches. A line for which his critics thought his use of said phrase would set back any hope for better relations between him and Moscow. Now, despite Reagan's firm stance, he wanted to pursue better relations with Russia and Russian Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev himself was very willing to work with Reagan, and the two pursued several areas of discussion, culminating in the 1987 Intermediate Range Missile Force Treaty, in which it was agreed to scrap an entire class of nuclear missiles, totaling about 2,500 altogether. Reagan challenged communism whenever he could, assisting countries like Poland who were fighting communism and calling for discussions. One such challenge was actually to remove the wall. Quote from Reagan, who challenged Mikhail Gorbachev, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now, in 1983, the U.S. endured a setback in Lebanon, in which, during a clash between a Palestinian Liberation Force, Syrians, and Israelis, U.S. soldiers were stationed in Beirut to keep peace. The soldiers were victims of a suicide bombing, and about 241 Americans were killed. After the soldiers were stationed on ships nearby off the coast of Lebanon. Also in 1983, the U.S. intervened in Grenada due to the government being seen as a threat because of its ties with Cuba. The government was disposed, and the Americans there were rescued. There were some Americans that they were not allowing to leave Grenada. Now, the biggest thing that happened during Reagan's term was known as the Iran-Contra scandal. And for this, we need some backstory. So, the country of El Salvador was enduring a civil war between the right-wing government and the communist revolutionaries. Nicaragua communist government assisted the Salvadorian rebels and allowed them to operate from bases in Nicaragua. Now, the U.S. supported the government of El Salvador with aid and military advisors, and the CIA helped to support Nicaraguan guerrilla groups called Contras. Now, these Contras were against communism and they struck at the communist revolutionaries from bases in yet another country, Honduras. Now, the overriding goal for this was to contain communism in this area. At the same time, Iran and Iraq were engaged in war, which the U.S. providing assistance to Iraq and Saddam Hussein. In the fall of 1986, it was revealed that people in the United States had been secretly selling arms to Iran, as part of these funds were going to be supplied to the Contras in Nicaragua. The central figure in this arrangement was a man named Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who operated out of the White House basement. What's important to note about all of this is that that type of thing was actually against official U.S. policy, and an investigation found the central figure to be Oliver North. Reagan himself was kept in the dark about the Iran-Contra affair, which enabled him to make repeated denials. North was convicted of minor charges, but those convictions were overturned on appeal. And the loose management style and the complicated dealings cost Reagan a lot of his popularity that he was enjoying. It got him a fair amount of harsh criticism. But let's go ahead and let's talk about George H.W. Bush. Before he became president, George H.W. Bush served as a congressman in the 1960s. He was a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in 1971 and served as chairman of the Republican National Convention while Richard Nixon was under investigation. Bush won the Republican nomination, and after much debate, he chose Michael Dukakis as... About that, misunderstood. Bush won the Republican nomination, and after much debate, Michael Dukakis was selected for the Democratic nomination. Apologize. Bush's main aspect for his campaigning was declaring that he would tell Congress, "Read my lips, no new taxes." The campaign itself was especially vicious. Democrats charged that Bush was involved in the Iran-Contra affair, that Bush would do nothing to solve the problem of deficit spending, whereas Republicans countered that Dukakis was just another big spending liberal who was soft on crime and all these other things. But out of all of this, Bush did emerge with the presidency. Bush won with a 54% popular vote and a 426 to 111 electoral win. Bush was actually the first incumbent president to be elected president since 1836. Now, the major domestic problem during Bush's term was the sagging economy and the increased federal deficit. The national debt itself had tripled since 1980 and stood at about $2.6 trillion. Not only did America continue to have a deficit in its trade balance, the U.S. itself endured a recession from 1990 to 1991. This was compounding by the failure of the savings and loan industry, which were competitors with banks in providing mortgage loans and other financial services. And when those investments turned sour, because what they would do is they would take their depositors' money and put it into high-risk bonds and other speculative ventures. But when those deals didn't work out, hundreds of S&Ls went broke. Failed institutions were sold, closed, or merged, and federal savings and loan insurance companies had to pay depositors the money they had lost. All savings and loan companies eventually closed, and the entire debacle cost taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. The federal budget was also another source of issue, due to Congress and Bush not agreeing on what option to take. Congress wanted to reduce the deficit by increasing taxes. Bush, on the other hand, wanted to reduce spending on programs and not include any new taxes. Now, the two did reach a compromise which included increased taxes over several years and worked to cut the deficit. And that compromise was reached in 1990. Now, during this point in time, a new Supreme Court justice was elected. The nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court was also a source of strife. After the Supreme Court's first African-American justice, Thurgood Marshall, retired in 1991, President Bush named federal judge Clarence Thomas, another African-American, to succeed him. Thomas was a conservative, but he was seen as having a fair chance of being approved. However, near the end of hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee, a female African-American professor at the University of Oklahoma Law School, whose name was Anita Hill, stated on television that Thomas had sexually harassed her at the University of Oklahoma Law School. Thomas denied these charges, calling it a high-tech lynching. When it came, and there was no other evidence or testimony supporting Hill's claims. However, the Judiciary Committee was split 7-7. The nomination was sent to the full Senate, where it passed 52-48. Thomas has been seen as a capable and intelligent Supreme Court justice since he has been elected, but many defenders of Anita Hill believe that she did not receive the treatment she deserved, and this incident did spark a new push for women's rights. Now, during Bush's time, there was also a conflict with Panama. The dictator of Panama at the time, General Manuel Noriega, was indicted in an American court on drug trafficking charges. In late 1989, the Panamanian national government actually declared war on the United States, and the next day a U.S. Marine was killed in Panama while stopped at a roadblock. President Bush then ordered 12,000 American troops into Panama to capture and remove Noriega, instill a government led by his opponents, move against the drug trade, and ensure continual access to the Panama Canal. Noriega was actually captured in this and was sentenced in 1992. During the 1980s, the communist sphere was beset by a number of problems. Mikhail Gorbachev sought to change the way his country interacted domestically and with other nations. By 1989, the Soviet troops pulled out of Afghanistan, and Gorbachev announced that he would no longer feel compelled to intervene in the domestic affair of other communist countries. This led to communist governments in Eastern European countries falling in relatively short order. Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria instituted democratic governments. Czechoslovakia divided into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And Romania actually became democratic after its own revolution. Germany, of course, had the most dramatic change, with the gates of the Berlin Wall being open and the wall itself being torn down on November 9th, 1989. Pieces of the Berlin Wall actually still exist, and you can go see them and the graffiti that was put onto them, calls to tear down the wall and things like that. It's important, especially nowadays, for us to keep that in mind and to remember this period of time in history. The wall itself fell on November 9th, 1989. Now, in Russia, a group of military leaders actually tried to seize power from Gorbachev through a coup, but this act of rebellion actually fell apart after heavy criticism. This rebellion was actually criticized to death. Leadership ended up being passed to a man named Boris Yeltsin by choice, and many republics in the USSR declared their independence shortly after. In line with all these changes, the US actually announced in 1991 that it would dismantle its nuclear weapons in Asia and Europe, and seek further reductions in the missile stockpiles of both, primarily the United States. And with this, the threat of Soviet aggression had disappeared. The Cold War of 40-plus years had come to an end, and China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam are pretty much the only countries that remain under communist rule. The last thing we need to talk about before we end today is the Persian Gulf War. In 1990, the country of Kuwait increased its oil production, causing a drop in world oil prices. Now, Kuwait refused to give in to the demands of Saddam Hussein, and his forces took Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. In response, President Bush mobilized a large coalition of nations demanding Iraq withdraw from Kuwait. Days after an Iraq invasion, Bush deployed troops of the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. Bush deployed troops and fighter planes to Saudi Arabia in what was known as Operation Desert Shield. The U.S. and Congress approved the use of force to remove the Iraq military by January 12, 1991, and over 500,000 American soldiers were stationed while diplomatic negotiations between Iraq and the U.S. and other nations continued. The U.S. gave Iraq a deadline of January 15, 1991 to withdraw from Kuwait. 2 days after the deadline passed on January 17th, with no action being taken, Operation Desert Shield turned into Operation Desert Storm. Coalition missiles and bombers attacked Iraq for several weeks, intending on weakening Iraq's defenses. Iraq's response to these missile and bombing attacks was to launch what were known as Scud missiles, built in Russia, against Israel and against Saudi Arabia. He believed that this would provoke Israel to retaliate, which would weaken the coalition against him. The U.S. persuaded Israel not to strike back at Iraq, so this plan failed. On February 24th, a ground assault of Iraq began. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers surrendered, and Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28th, only after 100 hours of ground attacks. Now, whenever it comes to deaths, the United States suffered less than 150 battle deaths and an equal number of non-combat fatalities, whereas Iraq suffered many casualties. Initial estimations put Iraqi deaths as high as 100,000, though later analysis suggests lower figures. The ceasefire that was eventually called was for Iraq to destroy its chemical and biological weapons, and to allow for international inspections to verify that said destruction was occurring. This was allowed, but inspectors were often hampered by their work, and Iraq eventually ordered all inspectors out of the country. No-fly zones were established over the north and southern areas of Iraq to prevent menacing of other countries. This was occasionally violated and met with firm resistance. The war also offered its first glimpse into the advanced state of American military technology. This international coalition offered hope that future conflicts could be quickly resolved. With the falling of communism and increased international cooperation, the president spoke about a new world order coming around. However, this new world order continued to look much like the old one as conflicts in the Middle East continued. Now, President Bush enjoyed a 91% approval rating after the events of 1991. However, this popularity as commander-in-chief in 1991 did not ensure him an election victory in 1992. But we will talk about that next week. Remember, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me or call me, and I will see you all next week. Have a good rest of your day.